If you see the world of supply chains, things are happening at a rapid pace. Let me give you an example. Take companies like Whirlpool. And if you look at their supply chain, it's extremely complicated. For instance, they have products such as microwaves, which are engineered in Sweden, they are manufactured in China and sent over to the US. They have refrigerators which are assembled in Brazil and exported to Europe. They have low-end washers made in Monterrey in Mexico for the American market. So you have this huge network, where we are designing products at one location, sourcing components in another location, and selling them in the global marketplace. And to manage this complexity, our students, our alums, the executives that we work with at Tepper, the big thing that we are hearing is that the complexity is increasing at a spellbound pace. Technology is an enabler and the business processes are lacking. And the tools that supply chain managers are to have are becoming much broader. They're getting more involved on the revenue side as well as the supply side. So what I'm finding is that, and we are trying to incorporate this in our curriculum, is to broaden the toolkit, expand their horizons so that they understand all the issues right from engineering to manufacturing to logistics and now even reverse logistics. So it's like managing this whole network, the value chain, where supply chain management plays a critical role. And in order to manage this complexity, you got to have a sound knowledge, the language of engineers, the language of finance and accounting, the language of marketing and sales, and the language of operations. So the summit was to bring together executives from diverse companies, from Europe, from Far East, from the US, and from Latin America, where we could share the problems that they are facing, and we from the academic side could offer some solutions. And that was how the summit got started. The key persons were our alum, the class of '97, John Walker and others, who sort of came up with this idea. And I said, let's now not only bring the alums together, but bring the executives from Pittsburgh and all our executives that we have worked with, and that's how the summit was launched. The issues, the best way to illustrate the issues is to give examples. And I'll again pick up example from Europe this time, from ABB, because ABB was represented by John. And you could see his problem. He has this network of 600 plants all over the world that he's trying to manage. The market is booming in China and India, and he wants to leverage the global footprint of ABB to serve the emerging markets. But then on the other hand, you have this complexity because you have a whole different types of enterprise resource planning system that he has to manage. He has to manage the tension between the country managers and the commodity managers. He has to manage across different cultures. And so one of the things we learned was that the organizational design has to be embedded nicely into the supply chain. One of the other lessons we learned was that as companies like ABB, Whirlpool, Harley-Davidson, as they manage their markets, the market migration has to fit with the supply chain migration. It's a constant adaptation. The market forces changes, the supply forces changes, and supply chain managers have to constantly interact with the marketing side to make sure that the migration takes place so that the customers are delighted, the suppliers are delighted, your employees are delighted, and the company makes money. The migration, now here's an example. I started off with the example of Whirlpool. Mexico, Monterrey, there were a lot of suppliers there who could offer components to Whirlpool and put in a facility next door to the US. Now in this case, they had to realign where these products were to be made. The same thing is happening with General Motors today. We have a lot of sourcing of components from India. Now, as you migrate to these new architectures in terms of sourcing, as markets develop in India and China, your design of the product has to change, your sourcing strategy has to change, your manufacturing strategy has to change, and that requires a constant juggling of the entire network. So that's what I meant by migration. The marketing side, the revenue side, and the supply side have to constantly mesh. If there's a slight disconnect, then you'll have both the forces pulling in different direction, and that can cause agony, where you may have more capacity at one location and the demand might be at some others, or you might have sourcing problems where you end up with recalls. And today, given the competitive marketplace, the customer does not forget. You want to be the Lexus of the world, as we just saw today's ratings. You want to be the Lexus. And if you do the migration properly, I always sort of emphasize, and this was time and again the summit underscored, that customers want things faster, they want products which are better, and they also want it cheaper. So the good old paradigm in operations where, hey, I could give you a product which is high quality, and if you want it quickly, it's going to cost you money. In other words, I could give you 2 of the 3 attributes, but the third one, you have to pay a price. So you got a high quality, you got it sooner, but it was going to cost you money. Well, the Toyotas of the world, the Lexuses, and some of the companies which were represented in this summit showed us that you can provide all the 3 simultaneously. You can give high quality, you can do it with a quick response, and you can do it cheaper. And that requires a good sourcing strategy, a good design strategy, an eye on what the customer wants. And that's what I said, the migration of the marketing side in terms of where the markets are evolving and where do you position your assets in this global footprint has to mesh well. And that requires supply chain managers, time and again in the summit we saw, you've got to understand the engineering aspects. MBAs without a sound knowledge of engineering are going to get into trouble. That's what I see. You got to understand 3D, you got to understand hardware and software, you got to understand networking architecture. That's the language of engineering. On the flip side, you got to talk the language of money, because at the end of the day, it has to translate into value proposition for your company, for your suppliers, and for your customers. That's the language of money. And the third is the language of people. You are managing people, and the employees are the most valuable asset of any organization. And therefore, when you run your operations, you got to take into account the people side, the processes side in terms of value, and you got to also make sure that the engineering complexities are managed. The summit emphasized the integration of all these 3 perspectives. All the stakeholders have to be taken care of. And in the audience, we could see, again, some of them were taking a financial view, some of them were taking an engineering view, some of them were taking a marketing and sales view. And we saw that the supply chain manager of the future has got to be not only technically sound, as Dean Dunn would emphasize, leverage the computing technologies, but you also have got to understand the people side. And that's what we have learned. We have got to blend the best from the Germans, the Japanese, the Americans, the Mexicans. This is the global marketplace. Tap the best talent wherever you can. Manage the network so that you create value for all the partners. This is an age of partnership. The ideas that that emerged were, and this was again, and this is what was one of the things that we had wanted will happen in the summit, would be that companies would say, here is the problem, okay? We don't know what the answer is. Can you, from the Tepper side, and we from the company side, can we work together? For example, PPG, Alcoa, and there were executives from both these companies. At the end of the day, when they sort of, after the deliberations were over, immediately problems were presented to the faculty, to our doctoral students, and that I think has set a call for action, where both our organizations, whether it's Alcoa and us or PPG and us, would work together, because I think we have to take into account the best from both sides. They have the problems, we can dream the solutions, but they have to be implemented on the shop floor. And that is where I think our research will get transferred to industry, and new knowledge will be created. So I see this as the knowledge supply chain which the summit resulted, where companies and ourselves, our faculty and students will work together. Time is running out because competitors, you saw what the announcement just a couple of days ago, Maytag, one of the companies, unlike Whirlpool, which is doing well, Maytag is likely to be acquired by one of the Chinese groups. Now, as the landscape changes, American companies have got to come up and dream of new innovations. And I think the summit sort of underscored the importance of pulling all these parties together and bringing out the best from both sides. I always sort of think of myself as a student. And I found that the summit was a great place to work with industry. And in 1.5 hours, you could see 20 companies expressing their problems. So in some sense, as a student of supply chain management, I was able to see the similarities across these companies, as well as some differences. So no matter whether you are ABB or whether you are Ford or whether you are PPG, there are certain problems that all of us seem to have. Technology gives us a lot of opportunity, but it also comes at a cost. There might be some downside risk associated with it. So I could see the opportunities, I could see the risk, I could see the problems that were similar and the problems that were specific to certain industries. I also sort of realized at the end of the day, I think that at Tepper we have reached a tipping point, but I think we have the opportunity to sort of leap forward and bring in the best cases, implementations, showcase it to our students. And it's almost like training doctors. We are going to bring the problems of these companies in the classroom. We are not going to discuss these problems, we are going to implement these problems and create knowledge. I think theory is going to evolve as we do these experiments. It is like we bring all the problems from the tool room to the boardroom. That's what we're going to do. The toolkit has got to be very broad, you see. You've got to be very good, and this is what Tepper is really good at, and that is analysis. But in analysis, it's a little more than analysis. You've got to have the tools to acquire the data. You've got to have the tools to analyze the data in terms of data mining, etc. And then you've got to come up with proactive strategies. You don't want to drive these companies by looking at some of the metrics which are backward looking. Typically financial metrics tend to be backward looking. You've got to look ahead where these companies are going. You've got to look at the customer metrics. You've got to look at the process metrics. And these are leading indicators of change. So by leveraging the data that is now we can pull out from our enterprise resource planning system. Companies have invested several millions of dollars in systems such as SAP. Now the time has come where we have put these systems in place. We can pull out this data, we can analyze this data, we can craft these strategies which are forward-looking, and that is how these companies will be transformed, because the market forces are huge, and I think the technology is available now. On the second dimension of toolkit is, as you do this transformation, you're dealing with people. And in many of these companies, and the summit emphasized, in order to get the long-term gain, there is always a short-term pain, because some units might be adversely affected. If I start doing business process outsourcing, let's say, and I deploy some units in India who will help me in terms of certain processes, it might come at the expense of some employees in our part of the world. But in order to sort of move to that stage, we've got to make sure that everybody is happy, including the employees who might be adversely affected. And therefore, we realize that along with the analytical part, supply chain managers and operations managers have got to have a good feeling for the people side of the business. You're going to deal with Germans, the Japanese, the Mexicans, and the Indians. And each of them, you've got to be sensitive to the cultures in different parts of the world. And therefore, the toolkit has got to have two sides. One is managing people and managing change, leadership. And the other side is the analytics. And in the analytics, I think Tepper students are, they have time and again, they have proven they are good. But I think it's the globalization of operations, I think, which will force us to provide additional toolkits where students will be able, and our faculty will be able to operate in different parts of the world, be able to pull in data from all companies who are engaged in this network, and come up with strategies to manage this transformation, the market migration and the supply chain migration. I think we are taking actions on multiple fronts. One is changing the content of the courses, where we are, for instance, we are teaching revenue management, which is a new course, especially with the service economy in the US. You got to understand the revenue drivers, which really helps you to manage and craft strategies from the sell side of the business. So we are introducing new courses, for instance, data mining, which Michael Trick teaches, one of the most popular courses. Data mining is going to be extremely important, whether you are in operations, whether you are in logistics, whether you are in engineering. There is abundance of data, there is very little information. So you got to generate this business intelligence, leveraging the data. So that's what we are doing. The courses are being changed. On the other side, I am a firm believer, just do it. You are not going to learn by sitting in the halls of Tepper. You got to go outside. You got to go and work in the factories of ABB. You got to go and see the factories of Whirlpool. You got to go and see the factories of PPG. And as our students, whether it is our MBA students or our PhD students, the more they get contact with the real world, I think they'll begin to get a deeper appreciation of the multiple dimensions of managing a business. So I think we are providing opportunities for both our faculty and students to develop the content, share it with the students, but at the same time bring the latest out there in the world of operations into the halls at Tepper. So in some sense, it's like a continuous learning where the experiences of the managers, as the summit showcased, we were able to bring it straight into the classroom, and I bet all the faculty who were there will bring it into their class discussion in the fall semester. The rate of change is phenomenal. And we just can't afford to stick to textbooks. They are outdated. You got to get to the real world as fast as possible. And not only think of current problems, but think of what's going to happen a decade from now when in China, the energy problems we're going to have in the US, the problems in terms of managing this complexity of networks. These are the problems that we want to bring into the classroom and dream of the answers, given the toolkit that I just described. There are several ways we could do it. One is, I think technologies are available where we can package some of the experiences, some of the lessons that we are learning, and distribute it. The web is there, so we should be able to package it and disseminate it, no matter where you are in Alaska or whether you're sitting in India, in Goa. You should be able to pull it and share. The world community can quickly tap into our knowledge base because the distribution channel is now available. Secondly, I also believe that, hey, if there is a burning issue that you would like to discuss with us, you should feel free to send us an email and we'll get in touch with you, because as much as we are eager to share our knowledge with you, we are also eager to learn from you what are your challenges. So in some sense, we want to be the node where we are able to sort of pull in all the problems that you are facing, give back whatever we have learned in our research and all the implementation that we have done. Technology is there, whether we do it by packaging it and webcasting, or whether we do it over the telephone, or come on, stop by at Tepper. I'd be happy to pull in all our faculty to share with you and learn from you. Well, we have recorded the event. We want to sort of, we are going to package it, and so that soon it will be available to you. More importantly, I think, and as I mentioned in the summit also, Supply Chain Summit, SCS. In Carnegie Mellon, we called it the school, SCS is School of Computer Science. At Tepper, now SCS will be the Supply Chain Summit. So we would like you to stay tuned to what we do. We will showcase to you what we learned from all these executives and our partners that who came. But stay tuned for next year, because I think this is going to be a regular event, and there might be some intermediate events, but this is a knowledge supply chain from Tepper, and we'll make sure that the moment we learn certain things, we disseminate it as quickly as possible. And that will foster, I think, a new era in terms of knowledge sharing between you and us. I think new practices are emerging. You mentioned example of sourcing. Sourcing, a company like ABB, where you might be sourcing $2 billion of items, different commodities. It's a tough challenge, because not only it requires good strategies in terms of identifying how do you manage sourcing, given that the business units have a different way of looking at it, the country managers have a different look at it, the engineering and design people have a different way of looking at it. So it's not only just sort of coming up with the best source. How do you foster this change? The organizational design. How do you pull in the numbers to justify to all the stakeholders that this is what you're likely to save? How do you sort of assess what are the risks, because you're running a business and you don't want the sourcing to create major problems for you for a product that is doing extremely well. So in this case, we saw that folks like ABB, folks like John, he is thinking of several ways of making sure, by organizational design, by setting up systems, by coming up with the right metrics and providing the incentives wherein he will be able to leverage the global footprint of ABB and also tap at the same time the new sources which are emerging in China and India, at the same time making sure the business units are happy and it shows up in the bottom line as quickly as possible. So clearly the problems require multiple dimensions, multiple perspectives, from an operations perspective, from an organizational design perspective, from an accounting perspective, and from an engineering and a design perspective, because the entire supply chain is affected right from the beginning, right from the front end in design, all the way to how the product will be made, how the product will flow, and how the business units will get affected, and how the commodity managers will get affected. I think the technology is there. But what we saw in the examples were that it is the complexity itself is so huge that one has to step back and look at the forest and not the trees. I think it'll be hard to say that there is one organization that is doing well. I think from my travels and from my studies, I think we have to learn from every part of the world. We have seen plants in Mexico which were world class. We have seen plants in China which are growing up. Right now they might not have the complexity of the product that's made in the US, but if you see the rate of change is phenomenal. You also have certain excellent expertise in Germany, the tribal knowledge, so to speak. The example that I started off in Whirlpool, the front-end washers, the best washers, and this is what I quizzed in the summit, the manufacturer which makes the front-end washer and exports into the US, guess who it is? It's not a German, it's Whirlpool. It's an American company making washers in Germany, and these are washers which are, in terms of the energy requirements, are the best. So the question is, we have to go wherever we find certain attributes. There might be certain pockets of expertise in Germany. There might be certain pockets of expertise in IT. In India, there might be certain pockets of expertise in the US and in Mexico. The trick is pull in the best partners, design the system, and create value so that not only your company makes money, but everybody who pitches in. Lockheed Martin, which is one of our partners in our executive program, the Joint Strike Fighter, which is a great example, most advanced avionics. It's a product that is made as we sell these advanced aircraft for different governments in the world. If you see the manufacturing process and where the sourcing is, it's from several countries around the world, and you can see that the investment is huge, but the opportunity is also great. And the trick is bring in the best, what the world has to offer. The supplier health check is obviously when we start tapping new sources of supply in China or in India, you got to be careful that on one hand you can't just look at the cost. You got to make sure that the supplier is financially sound. You got to make sure that they are not only compliant with the current regulations, but they are able to adapt to the new regulations which are coming on board. You got to make sure that the labor laws are followed. So in some sense, the supplier has to sort of be assessed on multiple dimensions, because it's in the weakest link snaps. So even if one supplier defaults and last minute you have to start scrambling, your entire assembly line can come to a halt and customers will never forgive you. And therefore, I think as we start developing these new sources of supply, you've got to make sure, and there is a process of doing it. That's what we saw in the summit. There is a standard way of assessing these suppliers, especially in new markets that we are emphasizing today. Therefore, I think the supplier health checks is important. In the summit, I also sort of did the flip side. It's not just suppliers, it's also the customer health check. Just as the supplier we are assessing, the supplier is also assessing you as a customer. So if General Motors goes to Sundaram Fasteners in India, they make all the radiator caps for General Motors. Just like GM went and checked out whether Sundaram could give you the entire volume of the requirements of General Motors, and also with the highest quality at the lowest cost and most expeditiously in terms of lead time. Likewise, Sundaram wanted to make sure that GM is the best partner for them. It's a two-way street. So I think because if just like one supplier feeds product to you, you also in turn are a customer. So both parties have to be assessed. So it doesn't matter whether it's a supplier or a customer. You've got to have the health checks in terms of managing the flow in the network. That's what the summit emphasized. I think slowly as these companies, given the volume of purchases that they do, is so huge, one has to come up with a standard way of doing checks. It's like doing an audit in a company. Accounting firms, PricewaterhouseCoopers. Now today they're thinking of doing audits for Sarbanes-Oxley. There are standard ways that they will, in fact, it can be automated now. So sooner or later, I think the supplier health checks, once we streamline the process, I don't see a couple of years down the road, already it's happening, where I'll be able to automatically pull in information from the web of my supplier and come up with an audit trail of how my supplier is doing. So yes, there is a process and there's an opportunity to, because we want to make the process as simple, as reliable, and yet low cost. So yes, we should automate it. The trick is, have you identified the right metrics to check your suppliers? And that's what companies like ABB are fine-tuning. I think the notion of metrics will encompass a whole lot of things. The scorecard will be more forward-looking. There'll be a lot of emphasis on new product development. There'll be a lot of emphasis on metrics related to identifying new sourcing opportunities. There will be a lot of metrics related to customer satisfaction, because we have learned that all these metrics, which are forward-looking, are leading indicators of what your balance sheet and income statement look 5 years from now. The financials generally tend to lag a little bit, but the operational measures, the customer-centric measures, and that is where I see the world of CRM, customer relationship management, supply chain management, and financial management, and the engineering side will have to sort of integrate so that we can identify these metrics, which not only sees how a company is doing, because the health of a company also depends upon how good your customers are doing, how good your technology partners are doing, how good your logistics partners are doing. So the metrics will evolve more towards a network base. And so it's going to be a battle of the networks. How does Walmart compete with Sears? How does General Motors network compete with Honda or Toyotas? And what makes the supply chain and metrics most fascinating is sometimes these players that you are competing with in terms of networks might cooperate with you in some other network. And that's why I think we need to do some more research in terms of what these metrics are to be. And more importantly, what do you do to adapt? How do you change the configuration of the network? Given that you may have more capacity in one place and less in the other, you may have to shut down some plants, and that comes, employees are always adversely affected when you have layoffs and shutdown. So the trick is, how do you migrate such that the metrics go in the right direction, the employees are happy, your customers are happy, and your suppliers are happy. And the bottom line is, players are emerging in different parts of the world. So you should be able to bring into your network new partners who can add value. And you can also do it in such a way that you can do the migration of supply and the market in the best possible manner. I think if you see the growth rate in India and China, sometimes there's good news and bad news. China, the way things are happening, it's almost like a car which is going at 100 miles per hour, which either will take off or it might just crash. So there are problems in China, the rate of change that's happening. India, things are happening slowly, not at the pace with China, but on the other hand, India has a lot of advantages in terms of language, etc., in terms of partnering with the United States. No matter where you see, I think the Chinese and the Indians, I think, will play a major role in terms of working with our companies in the US. So I think we better get to know them well. We better get to partner with them well. We have to understand their problems. They have to understand our problems. Because they will sell products in our markets, we will sell products in their markets. So it's got to be a win-win situation. And I think, and especially when I go to India, I can see the enthusiasm. And I think the good old, I think our mindset should be that we are not here and you are here. I think both of us are at the same level where we will exchange our products, we will learn from each other, and we will design these supply chains for the benefit of mankind. Clearly, with automation, with hardware and software, I think what will happen is sometimes history repeats itself. So there might be some products that will, just like Volkswagen Beetle Reborn, you might have products coming back that had appeared 2 or 3 decades ago. So in some sense you're right. But I think in terms of manufacturing processes, I don't think we're going to ever go back. I think what we're going to do, the product might reappear because fashion and taste sometimes go back to what they were a couple of decades ago. But the manufacturing processes, I think, will leverage hardware and software. You will see a lot of software being integrated into the product. In other words, I might be able to give you a product that you might be able to quickly reconfigure to exactly your needs, your tastes, and your preferences. So you will get a lot of customization, but it will be software driven rather than hardware driven. So that's where I see differences in terms of preferences, in terms of what customers want might go back to some point in time. But in terms of how they are made, you will see a lot of deployment of hardware, more of software, where you'll be able to, let's say, reconfigure the car where it sort of has, feels like a BMW and might have a looks of something else and gives you a personal ride depending upon whatever comfort features that you want. So a lot of configurable product, whether it is a laptop, whether it is a microwave, or whether it's an automobile, or whether it's your home, things that we'll be able to quickly configure. So the consumer now becomes a designer in some sense, where you'll be able to quickly sort of adapt the product exactly to your preferences and needs.